I'm praying again that my videos work. At the last minute, we couldn't get the slideshow to even show. So it's going to be exciting. Anyway, this is the introduction to permaculture. And if you're wondering where the term permaculture came from, permanent was a word in the 70s that they were using for sustainable. So instead of sustainable, they say permanent agriculture, and it's agriculture, so permaculture. My hope for this presentation is that you'll see how the class material integrates, how it goes together, and this will help you do that, see it as a whole. That you will not necessarily take our word for what the latest information about horticulture is, but you'll question. You'll think for yourself and you'll question more. And also you'll consider changing your gardening practices. Today's takeaway, this is my dream, that you'll begin thinking of nature as a system, that you'll think about the interconnections, changing one part and how that affects another. One of the processes or one of the systems is right. Oh, good. The laser pointer. Well, pretend like I'm pointing at that picture up there. It is a process. It's the way the aquifer is replenished. And so you have water running from the rivers into bigger rivers that the sun is shining. You've got evaporation. The evaporation sets the clouds off. So you've got clouds, the clouds drop the rain. So it's a cycle. It's a whole system. That you will create a closed system. That is, you'll become self-sufficient, or as much as you can. I realize that permaculture was designed for farms and crops. So some of these things you just can't do in a city, but try as much as you can. With the closed system, the external inputs, you're going to reduce your use of external inputs. So bringing things onto your land, you're going to try to produce it yourself if you can. You're also going to reduce your waste and your byproducts. I want to convert you from a consumer to a producer. That you will consider your practices relative to future generations and how it's going to affect them. And you can make a difference. It's baby steps. The organization is half of its theory and half of its practice. The theory, we're going to talk about the definitions of permaculture. There's more than one. The background in history, how it got started, who the creator was, what the ethics of the system is. I'm going to try to convince you to have a different mindset, particularly changing the way you approach problem solving. And then we're going to talk about the permaculture design principles. Can you see your light standing in your way? Then in practice, we're going to talk about defining and working with the elements, and we'll talk about what the elements are. Some practical strategies that you could use, and then some additional resources. So definitions. Theoretically, it's a design system. It is for human existence, and it's sustainable. From a more practical level, it's a toolbox of techniques and hopefully some ideas that you could use. Further definition. A way to design primarily farms, but it's moved to urban areas. So again, you're going to have to sort of stretch your mind here and think about how you can make use of some of these things, because you may not be able to do them all. In fact, you won't be able to do them all. It's a more eco-friendly approach, it's a more sustainable approach, and it's a better use of non-renewable resources. The background is, again, it was originally for farm design, and then they expanded it to new settlements, and then they expanded it to human existence. It's based on observation. So whenever you're asking yourself, am I doing the right thing? Nature is your model. So you say, how does that happen in nature? How do they do it? So it works with nature, not against it. And just hold this this tagline, creates no unnecessary work. So if you're creating work for yourself, then you're not using good permaculture techniques. It uses techniques that help conserve and restore the earth, and it's sustainable for the long term. It has to make sense both ecologically, but you have to be able to afford it. So it has to be economically viable. And the idea is that you become self-sufficient, that you produce your own food and energy. The creator, this is a picture. Yeah. Okay. Oh, wait a minute. No. The Bill Mollison, that's Bill Mollison. He is now dead, but he was originally from Tasmania, and he had all these different things that he did. And what I liked about that is, for him, there was no one right way. He had seen it done in so many different industries in so many different ways that he really was open to new ideas. He developed permaculture with one of his students at that time because he ended up as a professor, David Holmgren. And Holmgren's still alive and still writing. And this all went down in the 70s. So you're saying, boy, is that old. Is that even valid anymore? But see what you think. He lectured in the developed world and then demonstrated his ideas in the less developed world, where it was cheaper and where he could get away with it in some cases. He taught by example, so he's not as theoretical as his work sounds. And does anybody remember what was going on in 1973? Oil, that was it. We had, OPEC had reduced the supply of oil, and the developed world was paying tons more, and it wasn't available, and we had lines at the gas station, and you filled up when you had half a tank left, because you were scared to death that you'd be caught out somewhere, and you wouldn't be able to get any gas. So energy was really important, energy thinking, and saving energy. And you'll see that in some of the principles. What I think Mollison's contributions were, he had the ability to research ideas and was very open-minded to the way other people did things. He selected the best and most workable of those ideas. He packaged them for presentation, his principles. He found areas for demonstration in the lesser developed world, and he presented those results to the developed world, and then used the money to fund more experiments, is what I would call it. There's ethics in this system, and that is that if you care for the earth, that is, you make sure that we don't damage natural systems. That results in caring for the people, so you meet people's basic needs in a way that's less destructive. And you do that by limiting consumption and sharing surplus. So the idea is invest our resources in caring for the earth and caring for the people. And everybody's happy. The goal is to reduce your ecological footprint and use fewer non-renewable resources. And I have a video to start us out. It's done by Jeff Lawton. He's in the video in 3 different stages of his life. You may not be able to hear this easily. I'm trying to make it play through the speakers, and the volume is really low. He describes one of the earliest experiments, talks about the process and the results. He's in 3 different ages, that's just for fun. And he has a strong Australian accent. I tried to do closed captioning on this one time, and it just came up with garbage because it really couldn't figure out what he said.
Everybody's found under plastic strips. Everybody's spray. Everybody's putting synthetic fertilizer on overgrowth goes, just like maggots eating the flesh off the bone, down to the bone. Literally like maggots, it's giant maggots eating it to nothing. So we designed a system that would harvest every single bit of rainwater that fell on 10 acres. There's 1.5 kilometres of soil, water harvesting, ditch on contour. And when they're full, 1 million litres of water soak into the landscape. And then I filled quite a few times over winter. And then we heavily mulched those swales with organic matter, which was trash from organic fields near the forest. Put that almost half a metre deep. And we saved that and mulched our swales, which are about 2 metres wide and half a metre deep on the trench. Then we put micro irrigation underneath the mulch. And then the uphill side of the wood, after we put nitrogen fixing behind pioneer desert trees, which help shade and reduce wind and evaporation. Also put nitrogen.
And see if it's any better.
Should it into the soil and structure the soil for us. And then on the lower side of the track, we put fruit trees, majoring in date palms as the long-term overstory in the end. And then we put in figs, pomegranates, guavas, mulberries, now some citrus. From months we had figs, and we get with figs on, which is impossible. We've done a course, male and female course, trained up locals, and we got a translator who's working for Project PhD in Agriculture at University. He got onto his mates and said, in agriculture department, when he said we couldn't grow figs, we got figs to grow, and how many got figs on them? You better come test the soil, because no matter what you say, we're either growing in somebody said, well, what we shouldn't be growing, or we decent the soil, and we're like, what we've done. They came in and the salt levels were dropping, so they became interested. The salt levels were dropping around the swales. You must have washed it through. See, normally a huge amount of water will wash the salt through to the lower levels, which just make the groundwater more salty. In the end, if you're salted 20 metres deep, if you keep doing it, and then it will take 1,000 years to recover. And we use only 1/5 the amount of water. So the water they thought we wanted it all through, and we use 1/5. Then we when they went through that, we use the same amount of water normally use on that one. So if we put that 50, originally people laughed at us because we didn't put straight lines in. We went on contours. So I can put some bulldozing, flatten the desert, and extract it, and we wanted on contours.
You can just let us know who it is in the lake.
We can watch it at home.
Yeah.
I'll send the, I guess we'll send the link out. You'll have to sign, well, you did sign in. You did sign in.
Say register, I should have her.
What's his name?
Jeff Lawton. It's called Greening at the Desert. Basically what they did is they went to Jordan and they built an area using, it was a desert area. They built it up with mulch and some chopped plants from the area that were there. Things that they had been clearing fields and burning, and instead of clearing the fields and burning it, they took the leftovers and created this. And it was a highly mulched area with berms and swales. And then he tells you where they put the trees, and you'll have another diagram later that sort of shows how that works. Then they were growing figs.
Talk into the mic. Thanks.
I have to be retrained, I'm sorry. Okay, so they were growing figs, and they're not supposed to be able to grow figs because the soil was too salty. And one of the guys that was helping this whole experiment, he contacted his department because he was a horticulturist. He contacted his department and said, we're growing figs and we're not supposed to be able to grow figs here. And they said, well, you must have bleached the soil in it. You must have put a lot of water on it. And so they went back and showed how much water they put on it. And it wasn't enough to have even begun to leach it. And if you do leach the soil just goes further down into the, down toward the aquifer. So it's not a good thing to do a massive leaching like that. And they were just amazed at what had happened. Not only that, about, I think it was close to a year later, maybe 6 months to a year, same guy was digging in the soil and he found these weird growths. And they couldn't figure out what it was. And it turned out it was a mushroom. It was mushrooms. They had mushrooms. They had enough moisture that they had mushrooms under there. They had life in the soil. They had worms. They had all sorts of stuff. So it's pretty amazing. And then it was an aid-funded project, among other things. And they ran out of the aid funding. And so it just was sort of left by itself to take care of itself. And he shows it maybe 5 years later, and it still has date palms, and it's still growing, and the people around there are still getting food from it. So he was talking about, you know, it's a garden. It's just like a garden. We could green the desert if we could use these kinds of principles. But it was a particularly good example of how to do that. So we're going to talk about, as soon as I find my clicker, different mindset and getting out of your logic box. But if you get a chance to watch the video, please do. I don't know that you'll see the same one. I put several together of his, so I don't think you'll get the whole thing, but hopefully you'll get the idea. I want to get you out of your logic box. So here you are, and there's your logic box. So you need to get out of your logic box. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to have 4 ways that we're going to think differently. One of those we talked about, nature as a system or a process. How you can observe nature's patterns and see how you can make use of that information. The problem is the solution. And dirty dirt. So nature is a system. Nature's process works this way. You start with a bare soil or a mound of dirt. And what happens to it? Well, nature abhors a vacuum, and she's going to do something to fill it. The first thing that happens is pioneer plants, and often those are the weeds. And they come first. Once the weeds start growing pretty well, then they begin to catch seeds of other plants in the area. And those seeds, as the seeds begin to grow, they shade out the pioneer. So the weeds begin to go, and then you end up with plants. The pioneer nurtures those seeds. The pioneer gets shaded out, the ground gets covered over time, and you go from weed to forest. It's a very slow process. The elements in nature are networked. And we're talking air, water, fire, and we're talking earth. Here's our process picture again. Nature is a system. What we're saying is that there are interactions between these elements and they're expected. We're not surprised when that happens. There's no focus on one element versus to the exclusion of the other. And the example of that we did in the rainforest. The countries that are involved in the rainforest wanted to make the land more productive. So they took down the trees in the forest and they started producing agricultural crops. Well, that's had some pretty disastrous effects for the rest of the world. But they focused on agriculture. They didn't focus on all the elements. It was just growing things. We are thinking about this from a growing food perspective. So what we want to optimize is the total yield, not the yield from any one element, but all of them combined. We're thinking polyculture, not monoculture. So moving away from agriculture as we currently do it, growing one crop, and instead growing multiple crops. The starting point, or where our best leverage is always where the limitations are. And this is another way of thinking of macronutrients and micronutrients. Your best crop yield is limited based on which of these elements is in least supply. This one happens to be nitrogen. What would you say is the next one that we work on after we get nitrogen in our soil? Where do we go next?
Potassium.
Potassium. You have to read sideways, but it's potassium is the second one. So that gives us the starting point, and we start with the limiting factor. Observing nature's patterns, okay? So, yes, okay. Connecting patterns to problem solving. We're going to observe nature's patterns, and the two questions we have to ask ourselves is, how can you apply this to problem solving? And what are the connections and surrounding influences? I like this particular quote because it makes you think. When you don't want to see, you don't see. So here's some of nature's patterns. And some of these are shown here in the examples, and some of them aren't. I just listed a series of the patterns. Fish scales, honeycomb. It turns out that honeycomb is a structure that is used in airplane wings, for example, and it makes them much stronger, but it keeps them lighter weight. Seashells, the spiral, is very useful. Natural sponges, that's here. You've got some sponges. And if the second video works, which I don't have great hopes for, but if the second video works, you'll see how the sponge applies. Seeds are another example of nature's patterns. They're very interesting if you get them under a microscope. Mushrooms, which is a filtration system. Spider webs, networking. Lichen. Turns out that lichen is used to monitor pollutants in the air. It captures the pollutants, and then they can chop it up and measure it and look at it. So typical patterns used in permaculture, the undulating edge, which is just used all over the place. But what you see out of a particular example in the upper right-hand corner is you get 8 plants in a row. If you make that undulating, you get 9 plants. You get, it's a way of using the edge effect. A wavy edge can hold more plants, expose more of their area to the sun and beneficial insects than a straight edge. So it's working more with nature. The one here at the bottom is circles, and it minimizes pathways to work the circles. Spiral is an herb spiral. It increases the production from a footprint. If you think of the herb spiral as a footprint, if you unrolled it, it would take up a lot more space, and especially with walkway. And then this elevates it. So you have multiple microclimates after that. You have an east, west, north, south. So we have an undulating edge, a circle, a spiral, and the next page is a network. So it turns out that the veins in a leaf are an amazing distribution system. If you think about them distributing nutrients and also taking the synthase the sugars down to the roots, you have a distribution system. Raised beds with a central path might be a way that you can take advantage of that. Or the mandala, the circular root form here, are keyhole beds. Each one of those things is a little keyhole, each of those little knots. And you can, especially in accessible gardening, you can have a wheelchair come into here, and the person in the wheelchair can work all of this with minimal effort and minimal motion to move. So it can be used for minimizing walkway and maximizing production. Observations, reading and interpreting. Looking at the vegetation present, you can tell soil type, fertility, moisture, and microclimates. If you know anything about archaeology, one of the things that archaeologists do when they go to a new area is they look at what vegetation is present, and they can find where the dump site was, because there's certain plants that grow where a dump site was. And so that's just a modern day use of that. If you see animal tracks, well, that gives you a hint as to what kind of wildlife is present. Plant shapes, you can tell wind direction. If I were to ask you on that photo, where do you think the wind is? Where would you say it is? From the right or the left? Yeah, it's going right to left, exactly. And it's sort of like an airplane nose. That's where the wind is, and you can tell it just by looking at the trees. If you're looking at a canyon situation, you'll generally see larger trees. If you're looking at the non-canyon side, the west side, you'll see cacti often, at least in our climate. Disturbed soil can tell you something about the site history. If you see ruts, you can pretty much guess that there's been some sort of automated equipment on it, and there's going to be erosion and compaction. In changes in topography, you can tell generally which way the water flows or where it's flowed. The problem is the solution. So Mollison was at some kind of a presentation that he was giving, and a lady came up to him and she said, "Snails are eating my plants." And Mollison said, "You don't have a snail problem, you have a duck deficiency."